When this man died, he left a sad little poem for his gravestone. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones.
That skull had a tongue in it, and could sing once. How the knave jowls it to the ground as if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder.
The poem did work. His bones have been left in peace. But his reputation, his reputation.
And now my lady Worm, chapless.
Now that has suffered quite a tossing and a turning these last 200 years.
Here's fine revolution.
Alas, poor William. He looks serene, doesn't he, here, dominating Poets' Corner. But the comments from the floor are a bit of a shock. Henry James, the famous American novelist, said, "I'm haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." That was Henry James. And then there's Dickens, who seems to like the fact that the life of Shakespeare is a fine mystery. And I tremble every day lest something should turn up. And Shaw, who, although not here, simply says, it would be positively a relief to dig up Shakespeare and throw stones at him. That was George Bernard Shaw.
Actually, I don't find the list that impressive. I mean, as soon as you have a god, as Jonathan Bates says, as soon as you have a god, you have apostates. And it's a game that people play. Not only has there never been as great an author as Shakespeare, there will never be as great an author as Shakespeare because the cultural conditions will not recur. Therefore, we have this enormously famous figure who is the first person everybody goes for.
It's bad blood there. I mean, I'm interested in these people. It seems to me that the people who think that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare are either American snobs who tend to go for the Earl of Oxford, or great British eccentrics.
At the top of a block of flats in London lives a man who's tried to make sense of all the attacks on Shakespeare. He's John Michel. He's written an excellent overview book, and in the process built up an amazing library.
It's remarkable how over the years hundreds of books have been written on this authorship question. Who actually wrote the works attributed to Shakespeare? Yeah. Particularly the Baconians. They started this business, first of all, the followers of Sir Francis Bacon, and all this middle shaft, they're all about the authorship of Bacon. The first book, I think it was 1856, was by an American lady, Delia Bacon.
No relation to Francis Bacon?
No, she was teased about that, but she always denied she was... Well, perhaps she thought she was related to Francis Bacon, but actually she was an American Puritan lady who came to England, tried to open Shakespeare's tomb, and then went a bit strange in the head, and her brother had to come from America and take her back. Up here is I suppose, the second most popular candidate, who is the Earl of Oxford. Edward de Vere got a great deal of support and a great many books written about him. Sigmund Freud joined in the debate. He was an Oxfordian. He believed the Earl of Oxford fitted the character of Shakespeare as he psychologically characterized him. But then the people who believe in Shakespeare, they're believers too, because of all the candidates, possibly Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, is the weakest. We don't even know if he could read or write. You know,
what a mystery, huh?
It is a great mystery. It's a delightful mystery too, because it takes you into very beautiful territory. The 16th century mind, so on, the 17th century.
What about Marlowe? Is he a candidate who appeals?
Marlowe has his supporters, and there's quite a number of books on him. And he's the only one really among the candidates who was a professional playwright. Yes, this is the key book in the case for Christopher Marlowe. Hoffman's a man who was Shakespeare.
Calvin Hoffman.
Yes, he was a man who opened the Walsingham tomb in Chislehurst Church. It's certainly the most amusing book in this whole subject is Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead? And Mark Twain got into the subject because when he was working on the Mississippi riverboat, Twain's colleague, the pilot, was very much against it. So Mark Twain took up the other case to give him an argument. And he said the more he went into the Bacon case, the more he was convinced by it. And now, he said at the end, I give up my life for it. People have become really obsessed, really fascinated and caught up by this subject, and indeed given lives to the study of it.
I don't see that the issue of authorship. I mean, the issue of authorship seems to me is a substitute for people, substitute activity for people rather than looking at the plays. It doesn't help us.
But the authorship debate has helped Mark Rylance, Shakespearean actor and artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. Amazingly, Mark thinks the real author might be Francis Bacon.
No, I really think it's the only rational response at the moment is to say that it has to be an open question, at least. It really has to be an open question on the evidence.
How did this come about? Well, studying Hamlet in order to play the part, Mark found great learning in the play, but nothing in the life of Shakespeare to show from whence came this learning.
So I came to it actually by finding something very helpful in the widening of my view of the learning that this man had. And at first I didn't think much of the authorship stuff. I thought, well, they can talk a bit about that. But then one morning I woke up and I thought, my mind is changing. I'm not quite sure anymore who did this. And that was an amazing moment for me when I came to not being quite sure. How did you, why are you making this film? Why are you interested in this?
Much simpler. I just read Calvin Hoffman's book and I was shocked, profoundly shocked. Shocked enough to want to know more about this Calvin Hoffman. Not easy. But I did find traces of him at this little church in Kent. Calvin, the novelist, the poet, the drama critic, and the amateur historian, was on the rampage. It was 1984, and he had finally, with tremendous difficulty, got permission, a faculty they call it, to open a tomb in this church. Not that of Shakespeare. That will never happen. And besides, he's not here. But of Sir Thomas Walsingham, young cousin of Sir Francis Walsingham, the spy master. Tom was friend and patron to Christopher Marlowe. In the tomb, Calvin expected to find a box of papers, play scripts that would knock Shakespeare off his pedestal. And this is Colin Saxby. He was there the day that Calvin's team went through the church floor.
Below ground was pretty unpleasant, actually. So I had these enormous lead coffins, huge weight, you can imagine it, with rotting remains. They were in liquid form, actually.
But now, how after 400 years could anything be in liquid form, a body? It makes no sense. It would be dry, surely. Dry as dust.
I don't know, there was quite a lot of liquid around. It was very unpleasant, and the smell.
But now Calvin talks about looking for a box. Did he mention that at all?
He did mention a box, yes.
And there was definitely no box?
No, nothing was found at all, just coffins. He was very disappointed, naturally, that it had all come to naught.
I am not disillusioned at all. My theory holds as solid and firm as ever. This operation was merely one clue. Others remain.
This is Canterbury, the birthplace of Christopher Marlowe. John Hunt sells books under the shadow of the cathedral. He would love Hoffman's theory to be true.
A cutting from The Guardian, the 11th of July, my birthday, 1983. That seemed most interesting. Calvin Hoffman, probably the most indefatigable friend the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe ever had, will travel to Italy next week in what he hopes will be the conclusive phase of his 30-year campaign to prove that Marlowe wrote the works of Shakespeare.
This is a seriously divided family. John's wife, Sue, has heard it all one time too often.
His idea was that Marlowe survived the alleged murder, lived in Europe, maybe in France or Italy, carried on writing plays, which he would send back to Walsingham, his patron.
Calvin suspected that Walsingham was the middleman, receiving scripts from overseas, having them copied into another hand, and then delivering them to a front man in the theatre world. This was a secret that Walsingham had literally taken to the grave.
So he got a faculty to open the Walsingham tomb, expecting to find plays written in Marlowe's handwriting in the tomb.
Thus proving,
incontrovertibly, that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare.
Marlowe's plays don't make you blush.
They don't make you what?
Cry.
Oh.
I mean, you don't burst into tears in Marlowe's plays. You do burst into tears in Shakespeare's plays.
My wife is sucking her cheeks in now. I think she's a Stratfordian, you see. You know, I'm pointing out.
Well, Shakespeare's a god. I'm sorry, whoever he was, if it was Marlowe or Shakespeare. What it is, Mike, is that the English take in Shakespeare with their mother's milk. We love him.
Well, some years ago, Calvin Hoffman, now when he died about 10 years ago, he left all of his wealth to the King's School in Canterbury, Marlowe's old school. And if anybody can prove that the poems and plays that are commonly attributed to Shakespeare were written by Marlowe, then they get half of the capital.
And how much is that?
I would hazard a guess that it's somewhere between £500,000 and £750,000.
My God!
So really? This is the biggest literary prize in the world. I mean, it's like Captain Kidd's treasure.
In Canterbury, I find a Marlowe theatre, but very little recognition of Marlowe.
Can I ask you if you've ever heard of Christopher Marlowe?
I haven't, no.
Thank you.
No. No, I haven't.
Okay.
Sorry?
Have you ever heard of a guy called Christopher Marlowe?
No, I'm sorry. He's a playwright.
Very good. You're one of the few who know.
He was killed here, wasn't he? He was murdered here.
Not here.
No?
At a place called Deptford near London.
Was he? Okay.
Well, Mr. Henslow, gentlemen all, a black day for us all. There is news from a tavern in Deptford. Marlowe is dead. Stabbed. Stabbed to death in a tavern at Deptford.
He was the first man among us. A great light has gone out.
No great light went out that day, says Hoffman. There was no death at Deptford. Just a very clever plan for Marlowe to fake his own death and escape the notorious Star Chamber. Escape into exile, perhaps to Mantua.
But look thou stay not till the watch be set. For then thou canst not pass to Mantua, where thou shalt live till we find a time to blaze your marriage, reconcile your friends, big part in the
Or perhaps to Verona. Two gentlemen of Verona, and Romeo and Juliet. Or perhaps to Venice, the Merchant of Venice, and Othello. All puzzles as to why the writer, whoever he was, set so many of his plays in northern Italy. Calvin died in the late 80s, and his books are long out of print. But his disciples keep on going around the world. They're seen as a bunch of scallywag crackpots, I guess. But I'm just fascinated.
This is Peter. Hello.
Mike, how are you doing?
Good.
Well, it's a great story. I mean, to be honest, that was, I think, probably more than anything what appealed to me when I read the Hoffman book.
Yeah.
Was what a great story it was.
Isn't it? Yeah.
I assumed that, once you get into, finding the facts about it, they would turn out to be a load of rubbish. But That was about 30 years ago.
And it wasn't true, huh?
And I still haven't been able to find anything wrong with it. Are you okay with dogs, by the way?
Yes, of course.
Because that's
That's your dog.
Peter thinks that he's discovered a clue to another author, hidden in the inscription on Shakespeare's monument.
I believe the whole of this, in the correct version, is a riddle. And it says, read if thou canst at the beginning. Read if thou canst.
Yeah.
And just thinking about this, it occurred to me that there was another meaning of read, which I discovered when I looked in the dictionary, which was to solve, to work out, to make out.
Decipher.
So, decipher, if you like,
Yeah.
if you can. And that makes more sense. Say, passenger, why do you go by so fast? It says.
Right.
Read if thou canst. In other words, work out if you can.
Yeah.
Whom envious death hath placed within this monument Shakespeare, it says. You could read it as saying, death has placed someone in this monument with Shakespeare.
And then there's John Baker. He devotes a very big chunk of his life to Marlowe, just south of Seattle.
Well, the secret is out. You know why I'm not a singer now, Mike? If I could carry a tune in a wheelbarrow, I would be lucky.
But does it matter that who wrote the play?
Oh, yes, it does. You know, we see these plays. Well, you've probably seen, the audience has certainly seen all of these plays. But do you realize that they're set in Italy? How many plays are set in Italy? Do you realize that? Do you realize they're about exiles? Exiles in Italy. Exiles who want to come home. Look at the ending of Two Gentlemen of Verona. The exiles want to come home. They beg to be brought back to home. So do you realize that they're about false identity? Do you realize they're about people who are resurrected from the grave? Several times, repeated themes in the plays. People resurrected from the dead come back and become great people again. So
It's Marlowe's story.
It's Marlowe's story again and again and again and again. If you think about this, and if you really think about what these plays mean, what they meant at the time, and you realize they were written by an intellectual exile, an expatriate, bang, everything makes sense again.
John owns and operates a historic cemetery beside his house. His Marlowe activities are just a passionate sideline. And finally, in London, there's Dolly Walker-Raitt, the Grand Dame of the Mallovians.
That's Dolly over there.
We're going upstairs.
She's the power behind the Marlowe Society and has been for 30 years. Her theories are interesting.
Oh, this cool cat called Marlowe. He was never lost.
But Dolly is tired and ill. She's almost 80. Her last book has been hard-going, and now there's dissension in the ranks.
Oh, this cool cat called Marlowe. It seems we've got the wrong idea. To literary history, he's quite a mystery. Was he really Mr. Shakespeare? And he lived and he loved.
Whether or not you do or do not believe that Marlowe is Shakespeare is fine. You are absolutely allowed to believe whether Marlowe is Shakespeare or not Shakespeare. Many people believe that there is overwhelming evidence that that is the case. Others do not.
It's Dolly Walker-Raitt of the Marlowe Society here. Hello, is that Mrs. Cannell? Yeah, hello. We want to come to Corpus Christi College this morning to film and see, of course, the portrait, but we haven't made arrangements.
There are 154 Shakespearean sonnets. If you rearrange them, you find that the themes of exile and loss come through sonnet after sonnet. This fits nothing that we know in the life of Shakespeare, and yet fits very well that of a man, Marlowe perhaps, forced into exile. This is the main theme of Dolly's book.
I tried to persuade Calvin that this was his only very valid
point that he should, you know, use this when he's giving his talks and so on. And then he said, well, Darley, that's how you call him, Darley, why don't you do it? You know so much. So I said, well, if I did it, Calvin, I would do it on the sonnets. That's all right, you do it. So I did, and I had 2 actors to recite the sonnets. Well, I gave the talk, and it went down very, very well. How heavy do I journey on the way, when what I seek, my weary travels end, doth teach that ease and that repose to say, thus far the miles are measured from thy friend. The beast that bears me, tired with my woe, plods dully on, to bear that weight in me, as if by some instinct the wretch did know his rider loved not speed, being made from thee. The bloody spur cannot provoke him on, that sometime anger thrusts into his hide, which heavily he answers with a groan, more sharp to me than spurring to his side. For that same groan doth put this in my mind: my grief lies onward, and my joy behind.
Beautiful. Calvin did agree that there were clues in the sonnets, but I discovered that he was much more excited by another discovery that he made: parallelisms.
I will give you an example. In the play of Marlowe called Tamburlaine, when he, the emperor, beholds his wife's Zenocrate dead, he utters these words: "Eyes look your last, arms take your last embrace." Lord, I thought, well, that comes from Romeo and Juliet, the exact words. Then another example. In The Jew of Malta by Christopher Marlowe, a character utters, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance." Well, that was immediately in 1290. And so on and so on. I extracted these so-called parallelisms between the works of Marlowe and Shakespeare, and the number grew to an astonishing number, hundreds upon hundreds.
Some of Calvin's parallelisms are pretty far-fetched, but he does have 30 pages of them. So I've got 2 actors to help me do some testing. One will read Shakespeare and the other Marlowe, and we'll see if they do sound the same. That is, when they decide who's who.
I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance.
I say there is no darkness but ignorance.
Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships?
She is a pearl, whose price hath launched above 1,000 ships.
Holla, ye pampered jades of Asia, what, can ye draw but 20 miles a day?
And hollow pampered jades of Asia, which cannot go but 30 miles a day.
Inhuman creatures, nursed with tiger's milk.
Oh, tiger's heart, wrapped in a woman's hide.
But stay, what star shines yonder in the east? That lodestar of my life, if Abigail.
But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun.
Whoever loved that loved not at first sight.
Whoever loved that loved not at first sight.
I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why this is a completely balmy theory. At the same time, there's like all balmy theories, it's built on a seed of truth. What Hoffman noticed is that there are lots of phrases and ideas in Shakespeare's plays that are derived from Marlowe.
Parallelisms.
Parallelisms, exactly. And Hoffman, in order to account for that, came up with the kind of ingenious idea that Marlowe really was Shakespeare. But I think we now, because we have a slightly less reverential attitude to Shakespeare's creativity, we see that Shakespeare was snapping up lines and ideas from all sorts of different sources. And it's not remotely surprising that he should have borrowed a lot, stolen indeed, from the greatest dramatist of his youth.
But what about if it wasn't borrowing and stealing, but collaboration? And what if Shakespeare was the junior partner in that collaboration? And what then if Marlowe didn't die at Deptford?
Give my friend a beaker of your best brandy. Kit. How goes it, Will?
Wonderful.
Remember this scene from Shakespeare in Love? Fiction, certainly, but an interesting proposal. Here we meet a shadowy Marlowe who seems to be much respected by Shakespeare.
I love your early work.
Marlowe is helping the bard with his plotline for Romeo and Juliet.
Romeo. Romeo is Italian. Always in and out of love.
Yes, that's good, until he meets
Ethel.
To think?
The daughter of his enemy.
The daughter of his enemy.
This comes from Jonathan Bates' theory that they were friendly rivals.
Or something. His name is Mercutio.
Mercutio.
Yeah, I see them as sort of twins in a way. They're both born in 1564. Very similar family backgrounds, sort of lower middle class, small town, father, upwardly mobile tradesman.
Yeah.
But they go in different directions because Marlowe gets to Cambridge and Shakespeare doesn't. So immediately Marlowe's ahead of the game and he becomes one of this group called the University Wits who are writing this very clever, sophisticated drama, taking the London theatre world by storm. So when Shakespeare comes to town, he's very much the poor man, the country bumpkin. So he's got to start competing. He's got to steal their thunder. And in the first few years of his career... Of the Wits, yeah. So in the first few years of his career, he's very much under the shadow of Marlowe. His plays imitate Marlowe's, but they're just simply not as good. So for Shakespeare, Marlowe's death actually turns out to be his big break. It's the chance to take up the mantle for himself.
Marlowe was much the more conspicuous as an innovator. He was really radical. Every single play he wrote was utterly different from every other play. I mean, the first tragedy he produced, the hero didn't die, that is in itself a radical innovation. Shakespeare was much more slow-moving in terms of his innovation, though in fact, of course, he went in the end a lot further because Marlowe got cut off early on and Shakespeare kept on going. And of course, homosexuality, as in Marlowe's case, you know, they that love not tobacco and boys are fools, as he is supposed to have said, that would have made him a rebel from the start. Shakespeare got married at 18, so he clearly was much more conformist in those respects. And there are those fundamental differences.
Now I'm in Stratford-on-Avon, the very home of the bard. Tourists photograph themselves in front of the birthplace, while next door, one of the greatest Shakespearean scholars gives a final accolade for Marlowe.
If Shakespeare had died at the age that Marlowe died, I think we should now regard Marlowe as the greater dramatist. The achievement of Marlowe by 1593, they were both born in the same year. The achievement by the time of his death of Marlowe was greater, I think, than that of Shakespeare by that age. I mean, Marlowe has a string of great plays.